Russia is hosting 17 African leaders at a Russia-Africa summit in St. Petersburg. It's a sign Moscow wants to strengthen its economic ties with the continent. According to Russia, its trade with African countries last year grew to nearly $18 billion. Its main partners are Algeria, Egypt, Libya, Angola, Nigeria, and Sudan. Russia's biggest export to Africa are weapons. They account for 44% of exports and don't come with human rights strings attached. Moscow is also an important food supplier, especially in grain. In exchange, it gains access to African raw materials and strategic entry, like port bases in Libya and Sudan. Odayinka Ajala is a senior lecturer in politics and international relations at Leeds Beckett University. I asked him what African nations hope to gain from the summit.
Well, thank you for having me. African nations have quite a lot of things to gain, but as I have stated previously in my write-up prior to this, the first thing on the list would be on issues relating to food insecurity. So I'm sure with the issues with the grain deal, food security and how to solve that grain deal will be top on the agenda. And secondly, they would also want to get some security assurances from Russia in terms of a new security architecture going forward. So there are quite a lot of things they can gain, but they need to be able to speak with one voice. That is the only way they can gain anything from this summit.
Yeah, you mentioned food security here. Earlier today, Russian President Vladimir Putin pledged to gift African countries tens of thousands of tons of grain. But at the same time, he's also destroyed Ukrainian grain export facilities that Africa relies on, and he's torn up an existing deal. So how concrete and how high are these hopes that there will be a real grain deal that emerges from the summit and not just gifts?
Well, personally for me, I think gifting is not enough at this stage, because how long are they going to rely on gifts? They need a steady supply of grains, and they need to be reassured that this supply would be guaranteed. So gifting is not enough, and that's why I say that there needs to be a strategy on how grain, not just from Russia, also from Ukraine, will be accessible to African countries. So this is not a matter of gifts now. It's a matter of how to maintain supply in the medium to long term.
Another aspect that's playing a big role in the summit is security. The Russian private military company Wagner has a strong foothold in a few African countries like the Central African Republic and Libya. And there it doesn't only interfere in these countries' leadership, but it also holds a lot of economic weight, for example, by running a vast mining network. Do other African nations feel wary of the influence that this private company holds on the economy in these countries?
Yes, absolutely. Many other countries, especially in West Africa, are very skeptical of the role of Wagner. Ghana is a very vocal voice, especially when it comes to this, because they are bordered in the north to Burkina Faso, a country that has very strong ties with Wagner Group. Nigeria also has spoken previously on this group. It's not really a problem in West Africa, where I am currently, but in Central Africa, West Africa, as you said, lots of human rights atrocities are carried out by these groups. They work with absolute impunity. The way their operations are very, very obscene in some areas. So, yes, I agree that many leaders in this region are not comfortable with the role. And one thing that I think should be on the table, or will be on the table, is the new security architecture going forward, which should be devoid of private military companies, including Wagner.
All right. Now, trade between Africa and Russia is lopsided. It's skewed quite heavily in Russia's favor. Is there apprehension among African countries about an uneven economic relationship?
Yes, there is. Although Russia tries to play it that, well, they are trying to increase trade. And that was one of the main agreement signed in 2019 on how to increase exports from African countries. It's still not changed a lot, obviously because of the war in Ukraine and then COVID prior to that. So this is one thing that the African leaders would also want to see how they can benefit, especially in terms of technology. I've seen a part of the agenda for this summit, and technology is one key area where Russia is trying to use to entice, if I can use that word, African leaders so that they will continue to remain allied to them. At the moment, Russia is weakened, especially in terms of geopolitical calculations, but they can still offer things like training. For instance, training of engineers, increasing the number of African students coming to Russia to train or to be educated. So I think they're still going to find a way around that. They might not be able to send ways or technology in terms of physical materials, but I think Russia will try to spin it in terms of training, extending training and increasing the education. So these are the ways through which, these are the kind of things I think will be happening in the next 2 days.
Olayinka Ajala, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
We're now going to our DW correspondent, Fanny Fachar in Riga. DW is reporting on Russia from Riga since the Russian government shut down DW's Moscow bureau. Fanny, we just spoke about what African nations hope to gain from the summit economically. What about Russia?
If you look at the different panels, there were 30 of them in the next 2 days, you really first would think that this is a purely economic summit in some way, where it's usually about trade, about cooperation agreements with regard to development, and of course, this part of this 2-day summit too. But if you zoom in on a little bit more and also look at the specific time when this summit takes place, literally just 10 days after Russia withdrew from that really crucial grain deal with Ukraine, then of course it has a very political meaning here for Russia. They're basically looking, bluntly put, for friends, for new friends on the African continent. Because of course it's not since yesterday that Russia has an interest in having allies in Africa. In fact, historically, if you look back on countries, for example, like South Africa or Angola, where when it was still the Soviet Union, the former Soviet Union supported these countries in their liberation movements. Historically speaking, already there's a lot of relationship from the past, but now there is a war in Ukraine. So for the past 1 year, of course, we have seen Russia being increasingly isolated on the international agenda. So they are looking to Africa and for new African partners. And I think that's really the main goal here for Russia and for Russia's President Putin, to make sure he can walk away from this summit by saying that not just saying, because he's already, of course, representing this summit as a success towards the Russian domestic audience, but also to know, actually, that he has more partners, apart from North Korea, for example, but also more partners in Africa.
Right, so looking for new partners and friends. You just mentioned the grain deal there. Now, during the summit, Putin has already pledged to gift grain to 6 African countries. At the same time, he called off the Ukraine grain deal just 10 days ago, as you mentioned. Now, how seriously can we take this present?
I can't look into Mr. President Putin's head, also given the fact that there was so much back and forth on the grain deal. So if you remember, yes, it came into existence last year, but for several times, in fact, Russia threatened to pull out, and actually, evidently, they pulled out last week. So now to answer the question just how serious they are to extend their hand towards some African countries, even though one should definitely know that, for example, countries like Ethiopia or Kenya are not receiving any of that promised grain from Russia, but rather actually states like the Central African Republic or Mali, where the Wagner Group is present, the state-funded paramilitary group by Russia. So having said that, and looking at this backdrop there, one really wonders not only just how serious they are, but also just what Russia expects to receive in return from the African countries that it promises to support.
Right, so perhaps a gift with contingencies. The first Russia-Africa summit took place in Sochi in 2019. How has Russia's economic influence in Africa evolved since that first summit?
It pretty much stagnated, I have to say. If you look at the numbers from 2019, and if you look at what President Putin said back then in Sochi 4 years ago, which is to double the trade volume from about $15 to $18 billion per year with African countries to around 40 billion. I mean, that's a massive increase which didn't materialize at all. In fact, the current number, the official number that Russia communicated was the one for 2022, which is $18 billion per year. So obviously, compared to other numbers, for example, the trade volume that the European Union has with Africa, around 300 billion US dollars per year, and China closely to 300 billion as well. That number that Russia is trading currently with Africa is quite small. But once again, that actually comes back to a first question here. Yes, of course, Russia is looking for more bargaining power by having a bit more influence over Africa, but it's actually more political than economic. However, of course, both economic and politics are interlinked in some way. But what we cannot forget and should not forget, of course, what Russia is really trying at this point to also have a political leverage to show to the international community, it's with Russia that you have to deal with if you want to solve problems in Africa. And right now, so many of those countries in Africa are struggling because of hunger, because of insecurities, problems that in fact originate and have worsened because of the war in Ukraine and originate from Russia.
Fanny Fitchar from Riga, thank you so much.